Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the We're Talking Movie Show. As always, I'm Andrew, joined by Cade, and today we bring you the latest edition in our top five favorite movies series. And today we're covering Cade himself. So let's get right into your top five, shall we, Cade? So coming in at number five, we have Seven from 1995, directed by David Fincher. David Fincher seems to have a almost superhuman ability at making mystery thrillers such as Zodiac, Gone Girl, The Game, etc. What is it about David Fincher's style that makes him so good at thrillers, in your opinion?
Well, I think that what David Fincher does really well, aside from directing great performances from his actors, is I think that he's really great at setting the tone for a movie, if that makes sense. I think that he does a great job creating a very thrilling and sometimes very dark atmosphere. He usually explores very deep themes in his movies too. Regarding the tone and atmosphere for this movie, I love his approach for the setting of this movie. We're not exactly sure where this city is, and what I like about it is that it feels so dark and mysterious, and I love how it's raining constantly throughout the movie. And I also love how we never get an actual idea of where this is. All that we hear throughout the movie is the characters referring to it as this place, which I really like. And I think what this movie does really well with Fincher, setting the tone is I think that he does a great job keeping us guessing, which is I think part of what makes his movies so interesting and it keeps us invested. And I think that's a big part of what makes his style so great.
That's actually a very good segue, which is this is a movie known for its very, very dark and very complex plot. Does a good job at keeping viewers as in the dark as the main detectives are, and we'll get to them in a second. Is that one of the major reasons you love this movie? Is just how dark and complex it is?
Oh, for sure. I'm a huge fan of detective stories and just mysteries in general. Been a fan of those since I was, I think, a toddler. They've always been one of my favorite genres in film and TV, reading, and gaming. And yes, I've always loved the dark and complex plot of this movie and the overall mystery. I think it's definitely super intriguing, especially since it focuses on, these two detectives hunting down a killer who uses the seven deadly sins as his motives. I think what I like about it is I like how dark and complex it is, but I also do like the ambition and originality that the film has.
Talking about originality, this is one of those movies with the unique aspect of the fact that the bad guy kind of wins in the end, with John Doe completing his masterpiece of the seven deadly sin murders. Is this movie amongst the best in the business when it comes to that aspect? The fact that the bad guy wins, obviously a couple of other famous examples of this would be like Empire Strikes Back and The Usual Suspects, etc. But is this one of the best in your opinion with that aspect?
I think it definitely is. I would argue that it's actually one of the best endings in film history, period. I love the ending of this movie. I really like that it doesn't have a happy ending. I think movies that don't have happy endings can definitely be kind of risky because, there's a pretty solid chance you might end up upsetting the audience completely. However, I think part of what makes the ending satisfying, just for me at least, is the fact that John Doe does complete his masterpiece. I think it's satisfying that the bad guy does win on some level because obviously we are rooting against him and we are rooting for the protagonist. But I kind of think that the climax of this movie would have felt kind of unsatisfying if all seven sins and motives were not fulfilled, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. A final highlight I wanted to bring up before we move on to your number four entry is the excellent one-two punch of leads in this movie. Because you've got Morgan Freeman as the so close to retirement in very jaded William Somerset, and then you also got Brad Pitt as David Mills, the hopeful but a bit hot-headed and naive rookie detective who recently got moved into the precinct. Is the two of them working together a highlight in this movie for you? Because this is this is a pairing of two absolute Hollywood hood legends.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love the chemistry that both Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman have. I also love how different detectives Somerset and Mills are from each other. That I think always makes for a way more interesting dynamic and story overall. I'm just a big fan of movies in general that focus on duos. I always like that. And this will come up later when we're talking about some of my other favorites. But I think it's always fun to see partnerships in movies, which I always enjoy. And I think the partnership of Mills and Somerset is always going to be one of my favorite duos in film history. I definitely love them as detectives. I think they're great characters. And again, Brad and Morgan both have great chemistry together. And I think that's part of what makes the movie so great and more believable too.
Yeah, an aspect I actually want to bring up is that this is very much the formation of their relationship in this movie. Because if I'm wrong, this whole movie takes place over the course of what, a week?
Yep, an entire week.
So, it's not like, oh, two grizzled partners who have been together forever. We get to see them come together in, the initial phases of their relationship, which is something you don't see terribly often. And I think that's another aspect. Normally at this point, I would ask, "Oh, is this your favorite performance from Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt?" But spoiler alert, we'll be getting. I know the answer to that question is already no, because we'll be covering two movies that feature these gentlemen a little further up the road. And actually, that is a very good transition into your number four favorite movie of all time. We are actually sticking with Brad Pitt and David Fincher, but we're moving 5 years into the future. We're talking about Fight Club from 1999. Now, as I just mentioned, this is the second movie in your top five to be directed by David Fincher. Is he a favorite director of yours?
Yeah, he definitely is. He's definitely one of my favorite directors. He and Christopher Nolan and a couple of other directors. Like we were just talking about, I've always liked his style and I always love how he tells stories and brings them to life. I know that one thing he's become kind of notorious for is the use of multiple takes during the production. However, he said in the past that doing so many takes is because he wants to make sure that they get the best one possible and that they just get it. And, I respect how committed and dedicated he is as a director. And I think that might be part of what makes him one of my favorites.
Much like your previous entry in Seven, this movie stars two vastly different characters being portrayed in great performances by immensely talented actors. In this movie, you have the insomniac and deeply emotionally disturbed unnamed narrator, played by Edward Norton, and the soap making Fight Club leading social anarchist Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt, again making his second appearance on this list as well. Are these the career best performances for you from these two bona fide Hollywood legends? And I feel like I know the answer to at least one of those.
Yeah, I think that these are my favorite performances from these actors. I know that there are a lot of great movies with Brad Pitt that he's given great performances in, like the Oceans movies, Seven, like we were just talking about, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which he won an Oscar for, and a whole bunch more. And I also do like Edward Norton in a lot of other movies, like Primal Fear, Birdman, Red Dragon. I think part of what makes these performances my favorites from these two actors, I think part of it is because of the chemistry that they have with each other. That's one of the main reasons that I love the movie. In a way, I think that because of the fact that they're also friends in real life, maybe part of their chemistry brings out the best in each other, if that makes any sense. I think that it also helps make their dynamic in the movie feel more believable too.
Yeah, I mean, if you're working with somebody you already consider you or one of your a close friend, it probably is pretty easy to have good chemistry with them as opposed to a complete stranger. Though that does actually lead it into a nice tie-in. Without spoiling it, how much do you like the big twist in this movie, and how does it stack up against other all-time great twists in cinema history, such as The Sixth Sense, Memento, or well, for the second time I've brought this up, The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh, I think the twist in this movie is definitely incredibly well done, and I think it's honestly one of the best twists in the history of cinema. Honestly, the first time that I had watched this movie, the big twist had already been spoiled for me, so I knew what it was going in. But I think a big reason of why I still liked it is because the movie still did such a great job hiding it. We obviously saw glimpses and foreshadows throughout the movie of what it would be. But what I like about it is that it never felt overdone or anything, if that makes any sense. And I really appreciate that because it wasn't like, oh, okay, I already know what's going to happen. When are we going to get there? Instead, I was just enjoying the movie, liking how they were setting it up. And yeah, that's part of why I think it paid off in the end, knowing what the twist was.
And does it rank amongst the all-time greats? Is it the greatest in your opinion?
The greatest, I'm not too sure about that. It might be top five, top three, maybe for me, at least.
That's still pretty damn good. Well, moving on to number three, we're actually sticking with 1999. Let's talk about The Matrix, a movie that I know you're a huge fan of. And well, let's get right on into it. This movie is often lauded for its originality, blending science fiction, action, hell, even aspects of fantasy and philosophy. How does this movie manage to blend those genres? Like, what does it do best? Is the writing, the acting, the effects, the characters, the direction, etc. How does it manage to blend such vastly different genres of film?
Oh, I think it blends it all for a lot of reasons. I think a big part of it is definitely the writing. I do love this movie for its originality and how it blends together all these different genres like science fiction and action, like you said. I think part of that comes from just the overall concept of what the Matrix is. And this relates to what Morpheus says to Neo in the movie, here rules can be bent and others can be broken. I think that the unlimited potential of what the Matrix is and the overall concept of the movie itself is part of why it blends together so well and why these different genres work so well together. And just to add on to the writing, the movie itself has such a great story to tell, in my opinion. The characters in this movie are great and they're easy to get attached to. And in terms of, the overall direction of the movie, I think the Wachowskis had a very unique vision for the film, and I think they executed it very well.
One high point of this movie that I would like to highlight and get your opinions on is the action sequences in this movie. Ranges from the very first sparring session between Neo and Morpheus all the way to the fight in the hotel lobby with Neo and Trinity against the agents. What is your favorite action scene in this movie? And where does this rank in the all-time action movies list, in your opinion?
Favorite action scene in the movie? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think my favorite one might be the shootout sequence in the lobby where Neo and Trinity are taking on all the guards. I think the choreography is fantastic. I also love all how the sequence utilizes slow motion without making it feel draggy or anything. Also, if I had to pick another favorite, it might be the big showdown between Neo and Agent Smith in the subway. I think that that's definitely great. And in terms of where I think they rank in the best action movies of all time, I think that those sequences are definitely some of the best ones. And I definitely think that they're good enough for The Matrix itself to be up there with other great action films like Die Hard or the Mad Max franchise or even the Terminator films.
Another part of this movie I need to bring up that's often that's considered a major highlight is the fact that you have not one but two big bads in this movie. Effectively, you've got the dual threat of the seemingly limitless machine army using humanity as living batteries and trapping their minds in the Matrix, and then you've also got the cold, calculating Agent Smith serving as the all-controlling force, keeping the subjects in line within the Matrix itself until he mutates to control it all for himself. But that's more of a sequel thing, and we'll get talk about that at another day. Which of these villains do you prefer? And for a genre like science fiction that has produced some all-time great bad guys, where do these two rank?
Oh, I think that Agent Smith is definitely my favorite. I think he's one of the best sci-fi villains ever created. And I think the machines are up there too. I think part of what makes Agent Smith as a character so interesting is that if you look at the movie, like we talked about, he's designed as a program. He's meant to keep subjects in line and eliminate any threats within the Matrix. However, I think that what makes him stand out among other agents in the movie and even the machines is the fact that he's a program who has some humanity. There's that scene where he's interrogating Morpheus and he explains how much he hates being there, how he feels trapped, how the whole thing just feels like a prison and he just wants to escape from it. I think that really says a lot about his character, considering that he's just meant to be, he's a program created by the machines. And I also love how his goal is the complete opposite of Cypher's. If you look at the character of Cypher, he wanted to be reinstated back into the Matrix because he hated the real world, whereas Agent Smith seeks freedom from the Matrix. So I loved that sort of clashing at the goals, how they were different from each other. So yeah, that's definitely a highlight for me.
And just for the last little question for this section, there are three sequels that followed this movie with Matrix Reloaded, Revolutions, and most recently Resurrections. However, those were not nearly as well received as the original movie was. What is your opinion on the sequels, and where do you think they maybe went wrong, maybe lost their way?
Well, in all honesty, I don't have as low of an opinion on the sequels as most people do. I know that they're not as good as the original, and the truth is that they've never really affected the quality of the first movie for me. In terms of where I think they went wrong, I think it's the fact that the first one was such a great standalone story. They completed their mission to unlock Neo's potential in the first one, and they were going to continue their fight to save humanity. And I think that's part of the reason because it felt like the story was already finished at the end of the first movie, in all honesty. Also, I think that the sequels got way more complicated than they needed to. And this relates to everything we found out in the sequels with like Matrix Reloaded with the Architect, how we found out that there were other versions of the Matrix before it, or in Resurrections when we discover that Trinity is able to unlock the same potential as Neo. Overall, I think the sequels just kept adding so much detail where it didn't need to be, and it just kept becoming more complicated because of that.
And honestly, I completely agree in that case. Now that we've ended that section on a bummer note, let's move on to number two. And before we get into number two, I have to say, when Cade and I were discussing making these videos where we're covering each other's top five favorites, we each guessed each other's top fives at first, and we actually did a pretty solid job with it. However, when I was guessing Cade's, this was the first movie I guessed, and the fact that it was number two on his list, I consider myself, pretty proud of that I, managed to get that. So for number two, and I'm genuinely shocked that this was not number one. But then you told me what your number one is, and we'll get to that in a minute. And that also didn't surprise me. For number two, we're going to 2008. We're talking about The Dark Knight. Let's start with the painfully obvious. Let's talk about Heath Ledger's Joker, a performance that instantly became a pop culture touchstone on the level of, in my opinion, Darth Vader. What was your initial reaction to the anarchist Joker, and what makes it so memorable to you?
Well, I will say this. I think it's definitely one of the best villain performances in history. And I think it's also just one of the best performances in general. I think that Heath Ledger definitely embodied the role completely. And what I love about it is that you can tell that he really gave it his all. And you can also just tell how much fun he had with the role. That's part of what made it feel more believable. And I think this version of the Joker is great. And I think one of the reasons why it's so memorable, aside from Heath Ledger, obviously, is because of how it stays true to Joker's character. And what I mean is, the movie does such a great job portraying Joker as an agent of chaos. And that's exactly what Joker is. He lives to spread chaos and mayhem. And that's one of the things that makes him so interesting as a character. And this relates to his plans to just plunge the city into complete anarchy by showing that anyone can be as bad as he is, especially with Harvey Dent's character as he manipulates him during the second half of the movie. Yeah, I think that is part of what makes him so memorable and such a great character and villain in general.
Another great, in my personal opinion, very underrated performance is Aaron Eckhart as Harvey Dent slash Two Face. A character shift we've seen presented in multiple films and media. We've seen it in cartoons, we've seen it in animated movies. Is this the best representation of the villain of Two Face, or do you prefer one of the other versions we've seen in the past?
I think it's definitely a very good version of the character. And yes, I do think that Aaron Eckhart is really great in the role. Do I think it's the best version of Two Face? I don't know about that. Well, I still think it's good. Honestly, my personal favorite version of the character is probably from the animated series from the 90s. I think that that was such a perfect adaptation of the character.
That is a really good version. Now, when we were discussing Fight Club, I asked you if David Fincher was one of your favorite directors, and you said yes. But you also brought up a name that we need to bring up for this movie. We need to talk about Christopher Nolan. Christopher Nolan has become one of the most consistently great directors of the last 20 years, and I think you'll agree with me on this. Has cemented himself among the all-time greats.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And this movie is definitely part of that legendary run. His entire Batman trilogy is. What is it about Nolan's direction style that made him such a good fit for directing a Batman franchise? Because upon first glance, looking at his body of work before this, it doesn't seem like he would be the kind of guy who would take the helm of a superhero franchise. So, what about his style made him so good, such a good fit for the Cape Crusader?
Well, I honestly think that part of the reason why he is a good fit for directing Batman is honestly because of his style. Here's what I mean. So, just in my experience, most of his movies usually have very deep and complex stories to tell. And this relates to some of his best movies like Memento, The Prestige, Inception. And I think that's the thing about Batman. A lot of his stories in the comics, film, television, gaming, a lot of his stories are very deep and complex narratives, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons why he is my favorite comic book character. And because of that, I think that might be part of why Nolan's style works so well with Batman and the world, because he's so great at creating something compelling and deep, and he knows how to keep us invested with that. Also, I do think what's great about Nolan is that he's very good at challenging his protagonists. And part of what I like about his whole trilogy is that in each movie, he kept challenging Batman in different ways. Like with Batman Begins, when you have characters like Ra's al Ghul and Scarecrow, what they were planning to do to Gotham, that was challenging Batman on a psychological level. This movie challenges him more on an intellectual level, because of how smart Joker is as a character. Then you have Dark Knight Rises. That one was meant to be more of a physical challenge. And honestly, Bane is a perfect fit for that if you really think about it. So yeah, I think that's part of why his style works so well with Batman.
Before we move on to your number one, I got one last super hot question for you. Is this the greatest superhero movie of all time?
That is a very good question, my friend. I think that it very well could be. Definitely top three at least. Do I think anything will ever come close to topping it? I think there's definitely a possibility. Batman and other superhero stories are going to keep going long after us. And I think if someone has the passion for the characters and the stories, then it can definitely happen.
All right. So now that we've covered social anarchy, we've covered detective stories, we've covered sci-fi, we've covered superheroes. Now let's just talk about a character-based drama. We're talking about your number one favorite movie of all time, Cade, The Shawshank Redemption from 1994, aka part of what is considered that holy trinity of excellent movies that came out in 1994 with Forrest Gump and Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, it is definitely an incredible movie. I would argue top five greatest movies ever made, honestly. I love the storyline. I love the characters. The cinematography is incredible. I love the main location of the movie at Shawshank Prison. For me, it's an almost perfect film, honestly. I could be wrong, but I think you mentioned once before that it might actually be able to crack your top 10.
Top 10 easily. Yes. Top five, not quite. It would probably come in at like 6 or 7, but we'll talk about my top fives in the next video. But Let's talk about The Shawshank Redemption. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty of it. The backbone of this movie is the friendship between Andy Dufresne and Ellis Red Redding, played by Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, respectively. And we see the origin of these two meeting and then the gradual growth and the two best friends that they become. Are these career best performances from Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman?
Yeah, I would say that these are their best performances. Morgan Freeman, I think, is probably one of my favorite actors of all time. And I know that he's been in a lot of great movies and given great performances like Unforgiven, Million Dollar Baby, and Seven, like we just talked about. However, this one for me has always been his best performance. And honestly, I think the character of Red has always stuck with me because of that. And, Red is such a great character. Morgan Freeman was the perfect man for the job. And as for Tim Robbins, I think that he's also a great actor. He's great in other films like Mystic River, The Player, and more. I do think that he was a perfect fit for the role of Andy Dufresne. I also love the fact that Tom Hanks originally signed on to play Andy Dufresne before he had to drop out due to his commitment to Forrest Gump. And while I do love Tom Hanks as an actor, I definitely think that Tim Robbins was the better fit for the role.
Yeah, I agree on that because I don't know, Tim Robbins, I think, is better at playing kind of like the hopeful, wide eyed character than Tom Hanks is. Speaking of which, this is, of course, a story adaptation. This is a Stephen King adaptation. In particular, an adaptation of the short story Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption from his Four Seasons collection. And Stephen King, one of the most accomplished authors of all time, with one of the highest outputs in literary history, whose films have been adapted countless times, albeit sometimes not in producing the best films. But is this the best adaptation of a King story, in your opinion?
I think it very well could be. Some of my favorite Stephen King adaptations are It from 2017, Misery, Stand By Me, and a couple more. But I think that this could be the best adaptation of his work. In fact, Stephen King himself said that when he originally read the script for this movie, he wasn't too sure about it. However, since he saw it, he said that it's now one of his favorite adaptations of all time. And I think that if the author is proud of it, then I think you know that you've done something right.
Yeah, you really have, and especially because Frank Darabont is the gentleman who directed this movie. Also directed The Green Mile and The Mist. It's like he only ever directed Stephen King adaptations, which I just find kind of hilarious. And the fact that he did really well with all of them, and the fact that he seems to have King's trust with adapting his works. I don't know. I just find it very fascinating. And then just to kind of wrap it up here, another major highlight of this movie that's discussed quite a bit is just the incredible ending to this movie. With the idea of Andy escaping from Shawshank Penitentiary, with it also revealing that he'd been working on that effectively since he got there and getting to do it with all of Warden Norton's money in tow. Is that the best ending to a movie? Because to me, it kind of is.
I think it definitely could be the best ending, definitely one of the endings. I'll put it this way. I consider some of the best endings in film history to be The Godfather, the original Planet of the Apes from the 60s, Usual Suspects. I think even The Dark Knight has one of the best endings in film history, to be honest. But yeah, I think that this could be the best ending in history.
All right. Well, with that, that has been Cade's top five favorite movies of all time. And as always, I'm Andrew, joined by Cade. This has been We're Talking Movies. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and also make sure to follow us on Instagram, Threads, and Twitter. And we will see you all very soon.